Hey there, and welcome to this deep dive into presidential executive orders. You've sent us some really fascinating material on this topic, and we're really excited to unpack it all.
Yeah, this is gonna be good.
We're going to be talking about, those directives that kind of seem to allow the president to bypass Congress, what they really mean, how they're limited, and the kind of impact they've had throughout history. By the end of this, you'll not only have a solid understanding of the basics, but you'll walk away with some seriously thought-provoking insights
Absolutely.
into this really powerful tool the president has.
One thing that I think often gets overlooked is how these executive orders really reveal the constant push and pull between the different branches of government. It's not as simple as, the president gives an order and everyone just snaps to attention.
Right, yeah, it's way more nuanced than that. Okay, so let's start with the basics here. How would you define an executive order for someone who might think it's just the president, bossing everyone around?
Well, it is a directive, yes, but it has to operate within the framework of existing laws. It's more about how those laws are implemented. You know how the president wants the vast machinery of the federal government to function day to day to achieve a very specific goal? And you're right, it's not about bossing around private citizens.
So it's not like I could just issue an executive order to get out of jury duty then.
Not quite, but it does have the force of law. When it comes to federal agencies and employees, that's where things get really interesting in terms of the limitations on presidential power.
Okay, so there are limitations. Let's get into those. It sounds like there's a very delicate balance at play here. What actually prevents a president from just issuing executive orders, on a whim, basically sidestepping Congress altogether?
Yeah, it's definitely not a blank check. One of the biggest limitations is that executive orders can't create entirely new laws. They have to work within the framework of what Congress has already passed.
So, using an analogy that I've heard sometimes, it's like the president's a chef,
Yeah.
but Congress gets to decide what ingredients are in the pantry.
Exactly. The president can get creative with the recipe, but they can't just magically conjure up new ingredients.
That's such a good analogy. I love that.
Okay.
But even with a fixed set of ingredients, I imagine there's still room for, some creative interpretation. What happens when someone thinks the president has kind of overstepped, gone too far?
Well, that's where the judicial system comes in. Judicial review means that the courts, ultimately the Supreme Court,
Right.
can strike down an executive order if they deem it unconstitutional, meaning that it exceeds the powers granted to the president by the Constitution. It's a crucial check on executive power.
So it's kind of like having a referee on the field who can call a flag, if the president tries to bend the rules too far.
Precisely. And then there's Congress itself. If they really disagree with an executive order, they can try to pass legislation to nullify it. Of course, the president can then veto that legislation, and that can lead to a potential showdown between the branches of government.
Oh, wow. Sounds like a very high-stakes game of chess.
Mhm.
Are there any other limitations that we should be aware of?
Yeah, there are two more key ones. First, an executive order's lifespan isn't set in stone. A future president can reverse or modify it, meaning it's not as permanent as a law that's passed through that full legislative process.
So it's more like a temporary measure then, reflecting the priorities of a particular administration.
In a way, yes. And finally, as we touched upon earlier, they primarily impact the federal government itself. It's about how federal agencies operate, how they enforce laws, not so much about directly dictating to private citizens or even state governments, unless very specific conditions are met.
Okay, so we kind of laid out the groundwork here. Executive orders have the force of law, but within these very clearly defined boundaries. I'm ready to get into some real-world examples to see how this all plays out in practice. Where should we begin?
Well, history is filled with examples, some that are lauded and others that are quite infamous. Two that often come up in discussions about presidential power for very different reasons.
Yeah.
Are Executive Orders 9066 and 9981.
Okay, 9066. That immediately makes me think World War II. This is where things get really interesting. The potential for these orders to be used in times of crisis, but also where we see the danger of unchecked fear and prejudice.
You're right to bring that up. Signed in 1942 by President Roosevelt, Executive Order 9066 led to one of the darkest chapters in American history, the forced relocation and internment of Japanese Americans.
Even those who are American citizens.
Even those who were American citizens. It's a chilling reminder that even with these checks and balances in place, fear and prejudice can create a climate where basic liberties are violated. Over 120,000 people, most of whom were American citizens, were uprooted from their homes, their businesses, their lives, based solely on their ancestry.
It's hard to believe that an order like that could even be considered constitutional. What was the legal reasoning behind upholding it at the time?
Well, that's where the Supreme Court case Korematsu v. United States comes in. In a 6-3 decision, the court actually upheld the order, arguing that the need to protect against espionage outweighed Fred Korematsu's individual rights. It's a decision that continues to be debated by legal scholars today and is seen by many as a low point for the court in failing to protect individual liberties.
A stark reminder that even the Supreme Court isn't infallible, especially in the face of, wartime anxieties. Did that decision have lasting implications?
Absolutely. The Korematsu case has cast a very long shadow. It wasn't until 1988, with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, that the U.S. government formally apologized and offered reparations to survivors. And it's still cited today in discussions about the delicate balance between national security and individual rights, especially in times of crisis.
It's a really, really important case to study and understand. Okay, well, moving from a very difficult chapter to one that I hope offers a sense of progress, you mentioned Executive Order 9981, issued in 1948. What was its significance?
President Truman used Executive Order 9981 to abolish racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces, a move that really reverberated throughout society. This wasn't just about military policy. It was a powerful symbol during, the very nascent civil rights movement and really laid the groundwork for broader social change.
Yeah, the military at that time being a microcosm of American society, rife with inequality. What specific steps did this order put in place?
It wasn't simply about declaring segregation over. It established the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services. And this committee's purpose was to ensure that the order's principles weren't just words on paper, but that actual policy changes followed. It marked a turning point in recognizing the contributions and the rights of Black and minority service members who had fought for their country yet faced discrimination within its very ranks.
What a powerful use of an executive order, to not just set a goal, but to create a mechanism to actually enforce it. Did this have any wider implications beyond the military?
This executive order is considered by many historians to be a major catalyst for the broader civil rights movement, paving the way for a lot of the landmark legislation in the decades that followed. It demonstrated that racial equality wasn't just some distant ideal, but something that the government could actively work toward.
Wow. We're really seeing how these orders can reflect a president's values and priorities in a very real way. What other examples from the civil rights era kind of showcase this?
Well, in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed Executive Order 11246, which tackled workplace discrimination head-on. This order prohibited federal contractors from discriminating based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.
In 1965, the Civil Rights Act had just passed. This feels like such a critical moment where the government was really using all the tools at its disposal to enforce these newly won rights.
Exactly. And this went beyond just saying no discrimination. This order included the concept of affirmative action, requiring contractors to actively work towards diversifying their workforce and addressing these long-standing historical imbalances. It wasn't enough to simply stop discriminatory practices. They had to actively try to reverse the damage.
Right. So for those who might not fully grasp what affirmative action means in practice, could you elaborate a little bit?
Essentially, it's about proactively working to ensure that historically disadvantaged groups have equal opportunities. In this context, it meant that federal contractors couldn't just claim that they were colorblind in hiring. They had to demonstrate actual concrete efforts to recruit and promote qualified individuals from groups that had been systemically excluded.
So it wasn't just about leveling the playing field. It was about actively working to create a more equitable outcome. Did this lead to any pushback?
Absolutely. Affirmative action has always been controversial, with critics arguing that it amounts to reverse discrimination. But its inclusion in Executive Order 1110246 really highlights how presidents can use these executive orders to champion social justice even when those ideas are met with resistance.
And did this order have a lasting impact on workplace equality?
It did. It's credited with helping to increase diversity in both the federal workforce and the private sector. And its principles are also reflected in later legislation, like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, demonstrating how these executive orders can actually influence the trajectory of legal protection.
Yeah, so these three examples, 9066, 9981, and 11246, really highlight this, I think, dual nature of executive orders. They can be used to enact discriminatory policies, but they can also be used to advance justice and equality. It all depends on the person holding the pen, doesn't it?
That's such a crucial takeaway. It's a very powerful tool that reflects the values and priorities of the president who wields it. And as we move on to other areas where executive orders have really shaped American life, it's essential to keep that duality in mind.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper. What other areas have been significantly impacted by executive orders?
Well, in a world where information is power, we can't forget the realm of national security and intelligence gathering. Executive orders have played a really pivotal role in shaping how the U.S. government operates in the shadows.
Okay, now we're getting into the world of espionage. This is where things get really interesting. I'm ready to delve into this world of spies and secrets.
While we may not uncover any top secret missions today, we can certainly shed some light on a particularly influential directive. Executive Order 12333, signed by President Reagan in 1981.
1981, the height of the Cold War. I imagine this order had something to do with countering the Soviet threat. What was its purpose?
At its core, Executive Order 12333 was designed to streamline and strengthen the intelligence community's ability to gather information and counter threats to national security. This meant expanding the powers of agencies like the CIA, NSA, and FBI, providing them with broader authority to conduct surveillance, counterintelligence operations, and even covert activities abroad.
Okay, so we're talking about some serious spycraft here. But with expanded powers come concerns about overreach. What safeguards were put in place to ensure that these agencies didn't abuse their newfound authority?
That's a crucial consideration. While the order did broaden the scope of intelligence activities, it also included provisions that were aimed at preventing unchecked domestic surveillance. It aimed to strike a balance, allowing for robust intelligence gathering abroad, while still respecting the privacy and civil liberties of American citizens.
A very delicate tightrope walk for sure. Did this order have a lasting impact on the intelligence community?
Absolutely. It's still considered the foundational document for how U.S. intelligence agencies operate today, even though it's been amended over the years. Especially after 9/11, to address evolving threats like terrorism, its core principles remain in place.
Well, it's incredible how an executive order signed during the Cold War continues to shape intelligence gathering in the age of terrorism and cyber warfare.
It really speaks to the enduring nature of these directives and their ability to shape policy for decades to come. And it highlights the importance of having clear guidelines and oversight mechanisms for activities that often operate in the shadows.
It's a reminder that even in the name of national security, we can't afford to sacrifice the very freedoms we're trying to protect.
Precisely. And this constant tension between security and liberty is a theme that we see play out time and time again in the realm of executive orders.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history isn't just something that we read about in textbooks. It's a living, breathing force that continues to shape the world we live in today.
And as we delve deeper into other areas where executive orders have made their mark, I'm sure we'll encounter even more examples of this delicate dance between power and principle.
You know, it's interesting how we often associate executive orders with these really high-stakes issues, like, war or national security. But they've also played a significant role in shaping something that's really fundamental to our well-being, the environment. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, after all, the president oversees all those federal agencies that are tasked with protecting our natural resources, right?
Exactly. And one executive order that really stands out as a landmark moment in American environmental policy is Executive Order 11-1990, signed by President Carter in 1977.
1977. Okay. Wasn't that right around the time that the modern environmental movement was really gaining momentum? I'm picturing, bell bottoms and Earth Day rallies.
Yeah, you're spot on. There was this growing awareness of pollution, habitat destruction, and the need for a more sustainable approach to our relationship with the planet. Executive Order 11-1990 was a direct response to that shift in public consciousness.
Okay, so what did it actually do? Did it create like a bunch of new environmental laws?
Well, remember, executive orders can't create entirely new laws. They have to operate within the framework of existing legislation. This particular order focused on protecting wetlands. You know those critical ecosystems that often get overlooked?
Oh, wetlands. Yeah, I remember learning about those in school. There's like nature's filtration systems, right?
Yeah.
But why do they need like special protection?
For a long time, wetlands were viewed as wastelands, areas that were just ripe for development or drainage. People didn't fully appreciate their crucial role in filtering pollutants, controlling flooding, and providing habitat for this incredibly diverse array of species. This lack of understanding led to really widespread destruction and degradation.
So this executive order was kind of like drawing a line in the sand, saying, hold on, these ecosystems are worth protecting.
Precisely. It directed federal agencies to avoid activities that would harm wetlands and to prioritize their conservation. It also mandated that they carefully consider the environmental impact of any proposed actions, particularly those that might affect these sensitive areas.
I can see how this seemingly simple directive could have ripple effects across a really wide range of government activities, from infrastructure projects to land management decisions.
Exactly. Think about large-scale projects like highways or dams. Before this executive order, their impact on wetlands might have been an afterthought. Now agencies were required to take a hard look at the potential consequences and explore alternatives that would minimize damage.
A significant shift in thinking indeed. Was this just about protecting existing wetlands? Or did it go further?
It went a step further by encouraging agencies to restore damaged wetlands and even to create new ones whenever possible. It was a really proactive approach to conservation, recognizing the importance of not just preserving what we have, but actively working to rebuild what we've lost.
It sounds like President Carter was really taking environmental stewardship seriously. Did this have any impact beyond the federal government itself?
While it primarily targeted federal actions, it certainly had implications for private landowners and businesses, particularly those seeking permits or approvals for projects that might affect wetlands. It created an incentive to factor environmental concerns into their planning and explore more sustainable practices.
So it set like a new standard,
Yeah.
influencing behavior even beyond its direct legal reach.
Exactly. And it's important to note that this executive order didn't act in isolation. It paved the way for stronger wetland protection laws, such as the Clean Water Act amendments of 1977, which further solidified the legal framework for safeguarding these vital ecosystems.
It's fascinating how a single executive order can spark a chain reaction, leading to broader policy changes, and a shift in how we value and protect our natural resources. What other presidents have kind of made significant use of executive orders in the realm of environmental policy?
Well, President Clinton also left a lasting legacy. In 1994, he signed Executive Order 12898, which brought a crucial aspect of environmental justice to the forefront: the disproportionate impact of pollution and environmental hazards on minority and low-income communities.
Ah, environmental justice. It's a sobering reminder that the burdens of pollution are not equally shared.
That's right. For too long, communities of color and those living in poverty have borne the brunt of environmental degradation, often lacking the resources or political clout to fight back against polluting industries or inadequate waste disposal practices.
So how did President Clinton's executive order aim to address this issue?
It directed federal agencies to consider environmental justice in their decision-making processes. This meant identifying and addressing any policies or actions that might have a disproportionately negative impact on minority and low-income populations. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status, has the right to live in a clean and healthy environment.
A really powerful statement. Did this order have any practical impacts?
Absolutely. It led to the creation of the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, which was tasked with coordinating efforts across different parts of the government. They developed guidelines for assessing environmental justice impacts, conducting community outreach, and addressing environmental inequities. It was about giving a voice to those communities who had been marginalized for far too long.
We often think of executive orders as, unilateral actions. But this really highlights the importance of collaboration across government agencies to tackle these complex issues like environmental justice.
That's a key insight. Effective governance often requires breaking down silos and working together towards a common goal.
Okay, so far we've explored how executive orders have shaped policies related to civil rights, national security, and the environment. What other domains have kind of felt the impact of these presidential directives?
Well, in an increasingly interconnected world, we can't overlook the realm of foreign relations. Executive orders have played a role in shaping America's engagement with the global community.
That makes perfect sense. The president is, after all, the face of the nation on the world stage.
Exactly. And one executive order stands out as a really pivotal moment in America's global outreach. Executive Order 1924, signed by President Kennedy in 1961.
1961. The Cold War was at its peak, a time of both tension and opportunity. What did this particular order address?
It established the Peace Corps, one of the most enduring symbols of American idealism, and its commitment to international development.
Ah, the Peace Corps. I remember those iconic images of young Americans volunteering in these far-flung corners of the world, building schools, digging wells, promoting understanding across cultures.
It really captured the imagination of a generation. President Kennedy envisioned the Peace Corps as a way for young Americans to serve their country, not through military might, but through these acts of compassion and service to humanity.
A very bold vision indeed. Did it face any resistance at the time?
Some people viewed it as idealistic or even naive. They questioned whether young Americans, often with limited experience, could truly make a difference in the face of these complex global challenges.
But President Kennedy really believed in the power of people-to-people diplomacy.
Exactly. He believed that by working side by side with people from different cultures, Americans could learn as much as they taught, breaking down barriers, fostering mutual respect, and building bridges of understanding.
So it was about more than just providing aid or technical expertise. It was about fostering human connection and promoting peace through understanding.
You've captured the essence of it, and despite that initial skepticism, the Peace Corps quickly gained momentum, attracting thousands of volunteers, eager to make a difference in the world.
It's really inspiring to see how a single executive order can spark a movement that resonates across borders and generations. What practical steps did this order put in place?
Executive Order 1924 established the Peace Corps as an independent agency within the federal government. It set the framework for recruiting, training, and deploying volunteers to countries seeking assistance in various areas, from education and healthcare to agriculture and community development.
So it wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It created a lasting institution dedicated to international service.
And its legacy endures to this day. Since its inception, over 240,000 Peace Corps volunteers have served in 142 countries, making tangible contributions to communities around the world and fostering cross-cultural understanding in the process.
Wow, it's incredible to think about the ripple effect of that one executive order, touching countless lives and shaping perceptions across the globe.
It demonstrates the potential for executive action to not only address domestic challenges, but also to shape America's role in the world and project its values onto the global stage.
Okay, so we've explored executive orders related to civil rights, national security, the environment, and even foreign relations. It seems like these directives can touch every aspect of American life. What other areas have kind of felt their impact?
Well, no conversation about American life would be complete without talking about the economy. And you guessed it, executive orders have played a fascinating and often controversial role in shaping economic policy.
Okay, bring on the economics. I'm ready to dive into the world of dollars and cents booms and busts and see how presidential directives have influenced the financial well-being of the nation.
Get ready for a wild ride through the ups and downs of the American economy. One executive order that stands out as a particularly bold move during a time of crisis is Executive Order 6102, signed by President Roosevelt in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression.
The Great Depression, a period of economic devastation unlike anything America had ever seen. What did this executive order do?
This one might surprise you. It focused on gold. President Roosevelt, in a move designed to combat the economic crisis, ordered all Americans to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency.
Wait, the government was confiscating people's gold? That sounds pretty drastic.
It was a controversial move, no doubt about it, but President Roosevelt believed it was necessary to stabilize the banking system and increase the amount of money in circulation. The idea was that by taking gold out of private hands and replacing it with paper money, people would be more likely to spend and invest, thus stimulating economic activity.
It sounds like a really high-stakes gamble. Did it pay off?
The effectiveness of this measure is still debated by economists today. Some argue that it helped to prevent further economic collapse and laid the groundwork for recovery, while others contend that it contributed to inflation and undermined confidence in the currency.
It really highlights the tough choices that leaders face during times of crisis, and the fact that even well-intentioned policies can have these unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it underscores the power of executive orders to enact sweeping changes that can affect the lives of every citizen.
We've seen how executive orders can be used to address both domestic and international challenges.
Yeah.
Are there any other areas where they've played a particularly significant role?
Well, no discussion of executive power would be complete without acknowledging its role in shaping social policy, particularly in areas where, deeply held beliefs and values clash, and perhaps no issue is as contentious as abortion.
Abortion, a topic that has divided Americans for decades. How have executive orders kind of factored into this debate?
Presidents on both sides of the issue have used executive orders to advance their agendas. For example, in 1987, President Reagan signed what became known as the Mexico City Policy, which prohibited U.S. funding for international organizations that provide or promote abortion services. This policy has been rescinded by Democratic presidents and reinstated by Republican presidents, really reflecting the back-and-forth nature of executive power on this very divisive issue.
Yeah, it highlights how executive orders can be used to advance ideologically driven policies, particularly when there's gridlock in Congress or a lack of consensus on how to proceed.
It's a reminder that executive power isn't just about responding to crises or managing day-to-day governance. It's also a tool for advancing a particular vision for society, even on issues where there's really deep disagreement.
We've explored the impact of executive orders across this incredibly wide range of areas, from war and peace to the environment and the economy. It's clear that these directives have shaped the course of American history and continue to influence our lives in really profound ways.
It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it? And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's important to reflect on the broader implications of executive power and the responsibility that comes with wielding it.
I'm ready for that reflection. What questions should we be asking ourselves as we kind of grapple with the legacy and the future of executive orders in American governance?
As we've been going through these specific executive orders, it really strikes me that they're not just about the immediate policy changes they enact. They also kind of tell a story about the evolving role of the presidency and this constant, negotiation of power within our system of government.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. It's like each executive order is a brushstroke on this, canvas of American history, revealing not just the priorities of a particular president, but also these broader social, political, and economic forces at play.
Exactly. And as we think about the legacy of executive orders and their potential impact on the future, we have to grapple with some pretty fundamental questions. What are the limits of executive power? When is it appropriate for a president to act unilaterally? And when should they seek consensus through that legislative process? These are questions that have no easy answers, but they're essential to consider as we try to navigate, an increasingly complex world.
It's a reminder that we're not just passive observers in this whole process. As citizens, we have a responsibility to engage in informed debate, hold our leaders accountable, and advocate for the kind of world we want to live in.
I completely agree. Understanding the tools of governance, like executive orders, is crucial for informed civic engagement. We need to be aware of how these directives can be used, both for good and for ill, and really participate in shaping their use.
We've seen how executive orders can be used to advance civil rights, protect the environment, respond to national security threats, and even influence the economy. But as we've discussed, this power isn't absolute. It's constrained by the Constitution, the courts, Congress, and ultimately by the will of the people.
Precisely. And that brings us to another really crucial question. How can we ensure that executive power is used responsibly and ethically, even when faced with these incredibly difficult choices or conflicting priorities?
It's a question that has no easy answers, but it's one that we absolutely must continually grapple with as we strive to create a more just and equitable society.
We need to be vigilant in safeguarding our democratic institutions, promoting transparency and accountability, and ensuring that the voices of all citizens are heard in the policymaking process.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the history, the mechanics, the impact of executive orders, revealing their potential for both progress and peril.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope it sparked your curiosity to learn more about this often overlooked aspect of American governance.
Oh, I know. I've learned a lot. And I hope our listeners feel empowered to continue their own exploration of this really complex and ever-evolving topic.
As with any deep dive, there's always more to uncover.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your journey of discovery. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, those curiosity gears turning, and those voices engaged in the great debates that shape our world.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.